Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for checking out this channel, and thanks specifically for checking out this video, because I think we have an interesting topic on the chopping block for today, which is the mythicist interpretation of Jesus. The main thing that we're going to talk about today is the idea that Jesus was purely mythological and that there never was a historical Jesus. We're going to talk a lot about the main torchbearer for this idea, so the main proponent of this mythicist school of thought, and that's Richard Carrier. He wrote a book called On the Historicity of Jesus, and we're going to review that book. Now, some of you may be familiar with this set of arguments. However, there is, I think, some important and relevant stuff that's going to precipitate out of this debate that I think is going to have some really particular poignancy that I'll focus on at the end of the video. One of the things that I will do in this video is I'll use chapter settings. So if there's a part of the video that you want to skip ahead to, you can skip ahead to whichever part of the video you want to get to, because I think there are some lessons that will be able to distill out of this debate that are really important and more broadly applicable. All right, so a brief introduction. We're going to talk about On the Historicity of Jesus, which is a book by Richard Carrier. That's the main book that recently has popularized the notion that there never really was a historical Jesus and that the story of Jesus was pure mythology. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my own qualifications to address this question. But first, let me address the channel in general. I just want to note that we're a new channel. We're very young and we haven't been doing this for very long. So I would love it if you give this video a like. So please click the like button. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. As a young new channel, that really does help us out tremendously. If you click the bell icon, that'll make sure that you get notified about future videos. And the most important thing to me is please comment on this video. Many of you who watch this channel are really very educated in a lot of different areas. So I really appreciate the discourse that we've had in the comment section. I read each and every comment myself, and I respond to every comment personally myself. So if you want to weigh in on the comment section, I think that'll be really intellectually enriching for me. All right, so a little bit about me. I want to talk about why I decided to weigh in on Richard Carrier's perspective on Jesus as a myth, and just talk a little bit about what my academic perspective is. So I've said this in some other videos, but it is particularly relevant for this video, and that's that I'm a university professor. I'm a professor at a major university on a tenure track. Okay, now I'm not a professor in any field related to the historicity of Jesus. So my expertise is definitely not in this field, but I do have a set of skills for academic criticism. So in other words, I have editorial experience in the major journal in my field, and I'm also one of the top-rated reviewers for that journal. So since that journal kept records, I'm one of the most prolific and most recognized reviewers for the main journal in my field. Now, because of this, I have kind of a more honed perspective on academic rigorousness and intellectual scrupulousness. So that's the skill set and value system that I really want to bring to bear on Richard Carrier's arguments about the historical Jesus. So that's just sort of a brief introduction to my set of qualifications for why I think I'm able to have an opinion on this topic and whether or not that opinion matters. All right, so let's talk about first all the reasons why we think Jesus was really a historical individual. Now, there's two main arguments that we'll go into, and then we'll go into sort of individual citations. Maybe the first and most important main argument is that the consensus opinion of almost every scholar is that Jesus did exist. Okay, so almost every historian, from an atheistic to a Christian side of the spectrum, apologists and atheists alike, all believe that Jesus really was a historical individual. It's not often that we have that degree of agreement among all scholars. Now, as far as I could tell, when I looked into the current status of academia and historical academia specifically, as near as I can tell, there is no historian and there's no professor of history anywhere in the United States or Canada with a university affiliation right now who believes that Jesus was purely a mythical character. So every current academic historian in the United States and Canada right now all believe that Jesus was, in fact, a historical individual. So I thought that was interesting, and that just goes to show how far the historical consensus around the historicity of Jesus has evolved. Now, the other important thing that I want to note is that we do have very early attestations from antiquity from the Jews, the Christians, and the Romans who all attest and endorse that Jesus was a real historical individual. Now, that's important because there are not a lot of sets of agreement in the ideas between ancient Jews, ancient Christians, and ancient Romans from antiquity. But in this case, we do have agreement between all three parties. So by way of contrast, let's look at the evolution of the mythicist perspective of Jesus. So this is a set of arguments that didn't really get advanced until the late 18th century. I'll put some names on the screen and some names of works that surfaced in the late 18th century. So in a very modern very recent time span, this argument surfaced. And it surfaced from some French philosophers, not necessarily historians, but rather philosophers, who posited that maybe some of the stories about Jesus were adopted from mythology. So from that argument, that has sort of evolved a little bit into the current tradition that Richard Carrier is advocating, and Richard Carrier is the most vocal advocate for this school of thought that Jesus never was a historical individual. So we have a very recent, very modern set of arguments, and I guess my point here is to just emphasize that we should probably trust some of the early historical records from antiquity more than more recent, very modern arguments about Jesus that emerged not necessarily from historians, but rather from philosophers. So I think that's an important thing to note. And again, I've shown on the screen some of the French philosophers who originally sort of devised this argument that Jesus was heavily borrowed from mythology. All right, now what we're going to do is kind of zoom into some of these resources to determine the degree to which we can trust some of these historical voices that endorse the fact that Jesus was a real person, at least at some point in time. So we'll talk briefly about the Christian literature. I won't dwell too much on this because many of you are already very familiar with this set of arguments probably, but we have the letters of Paul and we have the Gospels, and most historical scholars agree that the Gospels are at their core biographies that are theologically shaped, but they are meant to tell the narrative of a real person who existed. We also have a set of embarrassing details within those documents. So there are things that are hard to explain if you're conceiving of Jesus as purely a mythological story. In other words, if Jesus was de novo a myth, then why would you put in things like the baptism by John? This becomes kind of a hard and embarrassing detail to explain. So if Jesus was mythological and purely mythological, why would Jesus need to be baptized by John? We also have a discussion of the rejection of Jesus by his family. We have endorsements of family members that we'll come back to in just a moment. But why would you put in the idea that Jesus was rejected by his own family as a divine figure? That's not something you would put in if you were devising Jesus as purely a mythological story. You also have the crucifixion. Now, Richard Carrier does have some responses to this. His thesis is that the crucifixion was really a celestial or metaphorical event. But the way it's portrayed in the Bible is very clearly a very humanizing, very mortal episode that was very painful for Jesus. And it's hard to imagine why you would have an excruciating, very human depiction of death if you were writing about Jesus in a way that was metaphorical. The whole blood and water line, and that was actually endorsed by an article in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, in 1987, which described what physiological changes we might expect to see in somebody who was crucified. So that was a paper that came out in 1987, and that endorsed that, if you stabbed somebody after they were in hypovolemic shock, you would get not only blood, but a combination of blood and effusion as well. And that's the blood and water analysis that comes out. So again, this was a very human, very mortal depiction. Hard to justify if you're conceiving of Jesus purely as something that's mythological. Another important argument is that we do have early creeds about Jesus that we find in the New Testament. So these are phrases in the New Testament that seem to be written to be easily memorized. So these are mnemonic devices that we find in the New Testament. These are probably creeds or various passages that developed within a few months of Jesus' death and probably not more than 2 years of the death of Jesus. So these were very early on beliefs about Jesus. That's probably a little bit too early for a story to develop into a mythology. Some of those early proclamations include the pre-Pauline Creed from 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. Again, this is a set of phrases about Jesus that has meter and verse. We have Romans 1, 3-4, which is also a mnemonically formed hymn. We have Philippians 2, 6-7. This is also a Christ hymn with a very distinct structure compared to the other passages around this part of the Bible. We also have 1 Corinthians 11, verses 23-26, which is an account of the Last Supper. So a lot of the early proclamations in the New Testament about Jesus that ascribe Jesus with a very human form are written very early after the death of Jesus, probably a little bit too soon for a mythology to form, since it's within months to no more than a couple of years of the death of Jesus. Let's zoom in a little bit on the writing of Tacitus too, because this is probably one of the most recognized sources about the historicity of Jesus. So this is a quote on the screen from Tacitus. Christus, from whom the name Christians had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition broke out not only in Judea, but even in Rome. So here Tacitus is attesting to the fact that Jesus was indeed a historical figure. He led this movement, and they became the Christians. That's what Tacitus is. That's the historical background that Tacitus is giving us here. And it's clear from this passage that Tacitus believes that Jesus was indeed a historical individual. We also have the writings of Josephus in Antiquities, for instance, 18-30 3.3. Josephus advocates that Jesus was indeed a human individual. He had a human brother named James. That's something that comes from Josephus. So it's hard to imagine that Josephus would be so quickly after the death fooled into accepting a mythology in place of an account of a real person. We also have letters by Pliny the Younger, Lucian of Samosata, and we have some other traditions that I'll go into in just a moment. But I first want to acknowledge the way Carrier addresses Tacitus and Josephus. And the way he addresses them both is by saying they were not contemporary with Jesus. He does have some other criticisms, but the main criticism is that they were not contemporary with Jesus, and therefore they don't get to have an accurate first-person impression of what Jesus said or did, or whether or not he was real. Now, the problem with this is if you look at historical scholarship throughout time, historians are often writing things about times before those historians themselves existed, respectively. So, in other words, we expect that historians would write about the years before those historians were born. That's just something that goes on throughout history. That doesn't necessarily mean that we discount every historian who wasn't an eyewitness to the events that they're describing. So, we don't have that many historians from antiquity, so we do treasure the ones that we have. Now, I think Richard Carrier's point is we can't tell with complete metaphysical certainty that Jesus did 100% exist. But if we throw out the existence of Jesus as a non-historical event, then we essentially have to throw out a lot of history, and I think to do so really leaves us without a lot of intellectual enrichment that we get from academic history. So I think it's important to not throw out some of these attestations to the historicity of Jesus. And again, if we sort of weigh those against the viewpoints of historians or other thinkers who thought that Jesus was purely mythological, then we have those other more mythological ideas about Jesus emerging very, very late. So that should make them at least less trustworthy than the much earlier sources, which tell us that Jesus did indeed live as a person. So I'm not going to go through all the quotes about Jesus from all historians, but I do want to briefly mention the Toledot Yeshu. The Toledot Yeshu is an interesting resource about Jesus for a few reasons. Number one, most people who have studied this book agree that, and by the way, there are hundreds of different versions of this book, and essentially the Toledot Yeshu is a disputation of Jesus from the Jews. So this was essentially the Jewish writings about Jesus that were meant to portray Jesus in a very, very negative light. Most people who have studied this set of books agrees that it probably goes back to the 2nd century at the latest. So it could be a tradition that's earlier than the 2nd century. We don't have any copies that are that early, but we do have copies in various different languages. So there's about 8 different linguistic traditions and hundreds of versions of the Toledot Yeshu. And I've made a whole video about this, but you can do sort of a cladistic or semitological analysis of the Toledot Yeshu to determine how early the oral tradition behind the Toledot Yeshu is. And most historians think that this is based on again, there's most historians who have studied the Toledot Yeshu specifically. Most historians think that this was a very early set of rabbinical teachings about Jesus. So, and the Toledot Yeshu, interestingly, assigns Jesus with a patronym. So, in other words, they call him Yeshu ben Pantera. That means Yeshu, the son of Pantera. Pantera was a name of a Roman soldier. This is a very deep dig at Jesus, and it's obviously meant to pejorate Jesus. But the point that the Toledot Yeshu is making here is that not only was Jesus an illegitimate son, not only was Jesus a bastard son, not only was he an illegitimate son of an actual human being, but he was an illegitimate son of one of the worst types of humans that you could be, according to the Jews in that area, which was a Roman soldier. The point is that the Toledot Yeshu clearly says that Jesus was born of a human being. By the way, the reason why they selected the name Pantera is probably because of its similarity as a word to the word Parthenos. Parthenos is the Greek word that essentially means from a virgin. So, in other words, the Toledot Yeshu is sort of making fun of Jesus here by saying, yeah, he's born from a virgin, but that's because he was born by a Roman soldier who was his illegitimate father, and that guy's last name was Virgin. So in other words, saying, yeah, he's born from a virgin, but he's born from a dude whose name was Virgin, and that's why the Toledot Yeshu calls him Yeshu ben Pantera. This is a very deep, scathing dig towards Jesus. And this phraseology is also used in other Jewish works from antiquity. In fact, even the Talmud itself talks about Jesus who was hanged on the Passover. So this is almost certainly a reference to the same Yeshu ben Pantera that's mentioned in the Toledot Yeshu. And the Toledot Yeshu also affirms that, Jesus who was hanged on Passover is a phrase that shows up often in this work. So we have a very high degree of certainty that the Toledot Yeshu is describing a human being. They're assigning him a patronym. They're assigning him specifically an illegitimate birth. And they're also, describing this as clearly a human being, an individual. All right, so that is the set of historical documents, just in brief, that address the fact that Jesus was indeed a historical figure. Now, let's turn our attention to the arguments that Carrier makes. And we're going to talk about his arguments, and then we're going to sort of develop a critique of his book on the historicity of Jesus. All right, so one of Carrier's main arguments and one of his best-known arguments is the degree of similarity between Jesus and other mythical figures. Now, most historians have already sort of explained this away and said that most of the similarities that Carrier is mentioning are in fact very superficial at best. Now, Carrier lists a whole laundry list of mythological figures, and there's just not enough time in a video to go through each and every one of the figures that Carrier mentions. But the one that he spends the most time on is Romulus. So let's talk a little bit about Romulus and the differences between Jesus and Romulus. So, all right, the first important difference is that Jesus is grounded in historical realism versus Romulus, who exists only in mythical times and places. So there are actually dates that are given around the life of Jesus. Romulus never had any dates. Romulus never in his own mythology interacts with real individuals. Jesus, at least we know, interacts with individuals who are real. We know, for instance, Pontius Pilate was real. We know that Herod Antipas was real. We know that Caiaphas was also real. Romulus, by contrast, doesn't interact with any real historical sites or real individuals. We also have the death of Jesus versus the death of Romulus. Jesus' death is depicted as a public execution. With Romulus, we have a set of different deaths, depending on which set of mythologies that you go with, but most of them end in a mysterious disappearance of Romulus. Now, this is important because if you take away the death of Jesus, you lose a big part of the narrative about Jesus. So saying that, the death is different, but they're otherwise similar is kind of a hard argument to make. We also have Jesus who interacted with multiple witnesses versus Romulus being interacted with in his own mythology as a sort of a single vision appearance. We also have Jesus who had ethical teachings. Romulus did not have any ethical teachings. So Romulus is not depicted as a rabbinical authority. There's no ethical core of what Romulus was saying. Jesus is at the very least depicted as an ethical teacher. So there are a lot of very deep differences between Jesus and Romulus, and this is the mythical character that Carrier spends the most time on. There are other characters that the Carrier throws out, but he lists basically every mythical character in all of antiquity. So it's really hard to go through all of them, so I'll probably stop at that one. But if there are more questions about other mythical characters and their differences between Jesus, I can put those in the comment sections. But as many other historical scholars have echoed, there's a problem here because Carrier is taking very superficial similarities between Jesus and other figures and saying that those similarities are more similar than what they are. In my mind, this is a bit of an unscrupulous depiction of other historical mythologies in order to strengthen Carrier's case. Now, we'll talk about other problems with Carrier's analysis. One problem is that there's no peer-reviewed literature that cites Carrier's book. That's actually not true. There's only like 3 articles in the scholarly literature that I could find that cited Carrier's book. So that results in Carrier's book essentially being sort of an intellectual dead end. Now, of the 3 sources that talk about Carrier's book, the largest citation and the most legitimate is Daniel Gelada in a journal article from the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus. But this is a takedown of this book. So this isn't like saying, let's take this book, let's build on the knowledge base, let's publish other ideas around it. Instead, what Gelada does is he writes a very, very scathing review. In fact, I'll quote from Gelada later on in this video. But the point of this is that there's no body of literature that builds on Carrier's work. So let me give you this sort of a counterpoint of my own work. So I've written about, I think, 50 peer-reviewed papers. The biggest papers that I've written have been cited hundreds of times. So I think the largest one has been cited about 400 times. That means that there's 400 other people in my field who have looked at the papers I've written and said, this is important and I'm going to build on it by adding this point to it. And that's how a knowledge base grows over time. But what Carrier's done is he sort of, for whatever reason you can assign, he sort of created an intellectual dead end. That to me is sort of a bit of a specific indictment on Carrier's work. I think it's also important to recognize that number 2, the other big problem with Carrier in general is that he has never published any scholarly journal articles on Jesus as a myth. So in other words, he makes his argument in the book that Jesus is purely mythological, but there's not a single journal article that he has ever written that makes the case that Jesus is a mythological figure. So he's never put that in the actual proper journal, the journal-based scholarly literature. So that's surprising to a lot of people, but that is a fact. I've looked up Carrier's work in scholar databases. Carrier has published 3 different papers, but none of them have to do with the mythological perspective about Jesus. Now, just to underscore how small a body of work this is, of only 3 different papers, and it's really amazing that Carrier has parlayed just a very small body of work into such a ostensibly successful career, maybe not in academia, but among the lay public. I think that's really impressive. Like, Carrier is a devoted, rabid, and fanatical fan base, but his fan base is based on his own sort of self-promotion. It's not based on his success as an academician. So 3 papers is not very much. And again, none of his 3 papers have to do with Jesus as mythology. His 3 papers that he put out, is a very small body of work. Just to give you some idea, almost every university for academic promotion expects you to publish at the very bare minimum 3 papers per year. And often there's standards that are much higher than that. So again, Carrier has not made a significant contribution to the academic literature. And in terms of the scholarly, journal-based, peer-reviewed literature, Carrier has published 0 manuscripts in that body of literature. There's other problems with Carrier's approach to academia in general. He doesn't have any society memberships. The 3 big societies around early Christian scholarship would include the Society of Biblical Literature, the American Academy of Religion, and the Society of Classical Studies. I am a member of several professional organizations within my field. That gives me the opportunity to interact with other professors, other academicians, and to talk over my ideas, and to also stay current with what's in the field. Carrier is not a member of any society. Another problem with Carrier's approach is he has essentially sort of been waging this war in a complete academic vacuum. And by that I mean that a lot of people sort of say, oh, this is Professor Richard Carrier, and he gets introduced as Professor Carrier in a lot of his lectures that I've seen, but he's not a professor. He has never held a single academic appointment anywhere. He does have a PhD, so he has a degree. So he was a grad student at one point, and he graduated from grad school, and that's an accomplishment, and I don't want to diminish that. But he's never been in an academic rank. He's never had a tenure track position, and it's not super hard to get these positions. In other words, if Carrier had really kept at it and contributed more to the academic literature, he probably could have gotten a professorial position at some point. And by the way, it's not terribly hard to even publish in the scholarly literature. So it's a little surprising that Carrier has made 0 contributions on his main thesis to the scholarly literature. And it's alone is surprising. A lot of people don't realize that Richard Carrier is also not a professor. He's not a professor. He's never been a professor. And like I said at the beginning of this video, there's no professor who currently has an academic appointment in the United States and Canada, at least that I could find, who believes that Jesus is mythological. Now, Richard Carrier does make a big stink about saying that his book is in fact peer-reviewed, but there are several problems with this perspective. So the book is put out by a very small publishing company. It's, I think, called Sheffield Phoenix Press. So this is a very small publishing company. In fact, the biggest book that they've ever put out is Richard Carrier's own book. So this is essentially just one step above vanity publishing. This is not publishing by a big publishing house. If you look at the 3 academic publishers, I've written books for at least 2 of these publishers. It's Elsevier, Springer, and Wiley. And just to give you some idea of what their scope and scale is, each one of those big publishers has a peer-reviewed database of hundreds of thousands of individuals. Sheffield Phoenix Press, near as I can tell based on their information online, has a group of maybe a few dozen reviewers at most. So it is a very, very small publishing company. Now, the reason why their small number of reviewers is important, because this raises questions about how the blinding process was. Now, there's also some overarching problems with self-promoting, putting out a book, and saying that it's peer-reviewed. And the biggest problem is the following. When I put out an article in the peer-reviewed literature, that article gets put out. If editors like it, if reviewers like it, then the article goes into the literature, and then other people can read it and other people can cite it. However, if I were to write a book and I put that book out under like a very small publishing company, I have a deal where I get kickbacks for every book that's sold. Now, the whole point of academia is to sort of mitigate those monetary incentives to like say things that are more sensationalized or things that will accumulate a large audience from the lay public. For instance, you could imagine a setting where I said, here's my evidence that aliens exist, and I put out a journal article about that. A lot of people are going to be interested, and a lot of people will download that article. And if it appeals to the lay public, then a lot of people, then that idea can slowly sort of catch on over time. But when you put out a journal article, you're not supposed to have any financial incentives associated with your publication in that scholarly journal. So now there's people like Bart Ehrman who put out journal articles and books, and they sell their books. I think that's a sort of different issue. I'm not going to be as critical about that in this video, but the point is Carrier has only put out one work that advocates that Jesus is mythological, that is at all even arguably peer-reviewed, and I think that's a hard argument to make. And he's never made any arguments in the actual peer-reviewed scholarly literature, in my opinion. So as a result of that, I think you have to take his arguments with a big, big, big grain of salt. It's also very problematic that Carrier has statistical analysis in his book, and yet he doesn't incorporate any analysis from an actual statistician. So just to give you some idea of what the academic standards are, whenever I have a paper that I put out that has a lot of statistical analysis in it, I will actually get feedback from a statistician at a university who looks over my work and says, yeah, this is correct. And then that statistician will either be acknowledged in the paper or will be added on as an author. Now, Richard Carrier does have some statistical analysis in his book, but it's very problematic. He uses Bayesian analysis. Now, I don't want to lose too many people, so I don't want to talk in too much detail about what the statistics around or what the statistical basis of Bayesian analysis is. But I'll just say that it's a way of sort of generating what the diagnostic utility is of a test, right? The problem with Richard Carrier is he puts in a real equation. It's the real equation that he uses for Bayes' theorem. But Bayes' theorem is based on figuring out what the final probability is based on a pre-test probability. So basically saying, like, let's figure out what the pre-test probability is. So what is the probability before we do any analysis? And then we'll put those numbers into an equation, and then we'll get a post-test probability. That's a very terse ovary of Bayesian analysis. Now, what Richard Carrier does, though, is he figures out quantifiably what the pre-test probability is, but he uses his own numbers that he generates based on his own qualitative assertions to create numbers. So essentially, he's pulling numbers out of thin air. So this is a really huge problem with his application of Bayesian analysis, and it's totally, wholly illegitimate. At best, this is a pastiche of Bayesian analysis. I'll quote briefly from Bart Ehrman because he mentioned that Richard Carrier's use of Bayesian analysis is like bringing a tank to a knife fight and then not knowing how to drive the tank. And I would argue that what Carrier does is he brings a bicycle to a knife fight, and then he doesn't know how to ride a bicycle. So it's essentially a really deep problem. Essentially, what I'm saying here is Carrier's use of Bayesian analysis is predicated on him using numbers that are assertional. Now, they're real numbers, but as far as I can tell, there's no justification for the numbers that he uses other than his own qualitative assertions. And that totally obviates the point of doing statistical analysis. Why even use statistical analysis at all if you're not going to do anything that's quantifiable? If you're just underscoring your own assertions that are purely qualitative, why even use statistical analysis? It totally makes the whole point of statistical analysis moot. All right, that's enough on that point. Now, just a couple of more problems with Carrier's analysis in general. His bibliography is really atrocious. The reason why is he doesn't cite the main papers in his field. In fact, he kind of skips over a lot of the main papers. He also doesn't cite primary research. He goes to secondary and tertiary sources. So in other words, he's skipping a lot of the important primary research, and he relies on other people's summaries of other pieces of research. So essentially, he develops quotations that are sort of more removed from the primary body of research. Now, this is a common mistake among people who are early graduate students or people who haven't done a lot of research, where they realize that they really have to go back to the primary sources. This is something that actually you find commonly in the literature, but I would say it's particularly egregious in Carrier's bibliography. Another problem with Carrier, and I'll try and get through the last few of these because I don't want to make this video too long, and I do have many other problems that I could talk about, but another significant problem is that a lot of what Carrier does is he disputes individual sources, like he disputes Josephus, he disputes Tacitus, he says you can't rely on any of these other sources, and then he advances the ascension of Isaiah. But what he doesn't do is he doesn't give you a clear reason why the ascension of Isaiah should be accepted rather than other sources. So he takes one source, which is non-canonical, not part of the apocryphal literature, and he says this is the key source that we should be evaluating in our perspective, but he doesn't give you a reason why you should accept that key source while you reject all the other sources. So here's what would have been a better approach for Carrier to use. What he should have done is in the first part of his book, he should have said, this is the criteria whereby you should accept or reject a historical source in the knowledge base about Jesus. So here's the decision criteria. Let me lay that out for you, and let me show you why these pieces of literature that I select meet this criteria and why these others don't. And he also would need to have established how he would validate that decision criteria. But again, what he does is instead of that, he just disputes a lot of sources, and then he says, but this is something that you should accept instead. But there's not a real reason why you should accept the sources that he says that you should accept, and why you should refute the sources that he says you should get rid of. So in other words, he doesn't sort of establish any basis for that other than, he's accepting, of course, the sources that support his own argument and his own analysis. The last thing that I want to say, because it is an important point, is that Carrier often has a very strained, nuanced, or idiosyncratic reading of things in the New Testament. I'll just give you one example. There's many, many examples. But Carrier, for instance, will say, well, a lot of people have this analysis that James is the brother of Jesus. We find that in Josephus. We find it in the letters of Paul. We find it in the New Testament overall in the Gospels. So Carrier will say, however, that anyone can be a brother of Jesus, and this is really more of a metaphorical brotherhood. But then it doesn't really make sense, because then why would James be treated so differently by those other authors? In other words, if anyone can just be a brother of Jesus, why is James kind of put in a different category by the people who are writing about James? Why do they specifically call out James's biological relationship with Jesus? It doesn't make sense. Now, again, Carrier could have avoided this vicissitude, but near as I can tell, he doesn't do this. And the problem is he just advocates for his very strained, very nuanced, very idiosyncratic interpretation of things without first justifying that interpretation. One last problem with Carrier, by the way, is although his work is very disputational, disputes a lot of sources, he never establishes why the mythicist perspective should be the default perspective. So in other words, he's arguing against all these pieces of literature from antiquity, but he never establishes why, if you don't believe in those pieces of literature, you should therefore default to the perspective that Jesus was mythological. All right, so those are a few problems with Carrier's analysis in kind of a bit of a nutshell. I have many, many more that I could go into, but there's a lot of problems with the arguments that Carrier makes. Hey, everybody, I'm adding some additional thoughts as I'm editing the video, and this is kind of an important idea, so I hope this isn't too jarring, but I wanted to put this in. Usually when we have a theory that recontextualizes historical events, what we look for as an attribute within that theory is a better explanation of what's going on. So here's where Carrier's theory ultimately is really severely lacking, is it doesn't explain anything in the New Testament or in the history of early Christianity or in the rest of history that we understand with any better explanatory power. Okay, in other words, it still leaves all the loose endings that we already have in history. Moreover, it creates a bunch of new problems that are then very hard to explain. For instance, why did this idea originate to take somebody who's a mythical character and start lying about them and say that they were actually a human being who lived? What's the incentive for having that change in strategy? Moreover, if there was such a cabal, an internal conspiracy to tell people that Jesus was real when he was in fact just a mythical character, why didn't somebody expose that at some point in Christianity? At some point, a lot of these people were willing to die for that lie. People are willing to die for things that they believe are true that aren't true, so people are willing to die for falsehoods, but they aren't usually willing to die for things that they are lying about themselves. Moreover, if you're living in first century Judea and you want to get rich, and you want to ingratiate yourself to the Roman Empire or to the Jewish leadership at the time, you're just going to say, like, yeah, I'm aware of the fact that Jesus was a totally made-up character, and I'll attest to that. And, that person would have been very ingratiated to the Roman Empire. It'd be a great way to get rich quick at that time. So it's hard to imagine that nobody would have sold out the rest of this little internal cabal to make up a story that there was a mythical character and just lie about that mythical character and say that he was actually a personal being who actually lived. So in other words, Carrier's ideas don't just have less explanatory power than all the theories that we already have. In fact, they have a much lower explanatory power because they essentially create a bunch of new problems that are then very hard to reconcile. All right, back to the video. Now, I want to turn my attention, though, however, to talk about what are other things that other historical scholars say about Carrier's arguments. So let's talk about some other statements from other historical scholars. Again, the fact that Carrier's book on the history of Jesus is sort of a intellectual dead end in the scholarly literature is a testimonial in and of itself that there's not a lot of room to add on to this body of work. It's sort of an intellectual cul-de-sac, essentially. So Bart Ehrman wrote about Carrier, and he writes quite accurately, and I agree with this statement. He is not a scholar in the field. He has no position in a university or college. He's never taught Greek or New Testament or early Christianity, and has no academic access to any of the necessary tools of scholarship. So again, for somebody to be a junior faculty person, which is what Carrier would be if he even had a faculty position, and not have any mentorship pathway and not learn about the proper technique of research, results in a very problematic work, which you find in On the Historicity of Jesus. I think Bart Ehrman makes this point. And again, Carrier he's never been a professor. He's never had an academic appointment. He's never even had a university affiliation of any sort. All right, here's a quote from Daniel Gelada, who wrote a really good review article. Gelada, by the way, is a professor at Oxford University. Carrier's treatment of the evidence is deeply flawed. His use of Bayesian reasoning is subjective and circular, and his readings of ancient texts are strained. Ultimately, Carrier's case is filled with unjustified speculation, questionable methodology, and a lack of engagement with existing scholarship. Here's another quotation from Maurice Casey from the University of Nottingham. Carrier's ignorance of ancient languages and Jewish context is breathtaking. His book would never have passed academic review in any reputable university department. Richard Carrier represents the very worst kind of pseudo-scholarship dressed up as academic rigor. Here's one last quote from Larry Hurtado at the University of Edinburgh. Carrier's Jewish mythicism is an extreme case of amateurism masquerading as revolutionary theory. There's other quotes that I could have put in this video, but I'm going to go ahead and stop there because I don't want the video to be too terribly much longer. Now, I do want to put in two important points that I think are really important as an overview perspective about Carrier. But these are two important points that I wanted to add on that are, I think, important points to emphasize. Number one, as most of you know, I was a rather hard-boiled atheist for almost all of my adult life. When I first got into the study of Jesus, that's when I encountered Richard Carrier's arguments. And this is particularly the reason why I think this set of arguments is pernicious, because I think as an atheist, Jesus as a mythology is much easier to swallow. And I think that's the reason why Carrier's arguments have gained such a wide audience. It's not because they're based in any validified truth. It's because rather that I think if you're an atheist and you read that Jesus is a myth, then, you can kind of dismiss the morality of Jesus and you can dismiss all the lessons of the New Testament much more easily. I think that is the most seductive thing about Carrier's analysis, and I think that's why he's gained such a large following. I think that's just an important overview point to mention. The last thing that I want to say in this video, which is very important, is I think Carrier is an excellent case study in the dangers of working in your own intellectual isolation. Jesus said in the New Testament that if you meet with other people with the intention to study the lessons of Jesus, then, that's a valid, good thing to do. I'll put a quote on the screen where Jesus says that in the New Testament. He says, when, two or more people are gathered in my name, my presence will be there. I think we live in a society right now where we are tremendously isolated. Intellectual communities are really siloed off, and those silos are getting smaller and smaller, especially because we live in a society where we sort of potentiate our own echo chambers with social media. And I think Carrier really represents a really excellent case study in what the endpoint of that intellectual isolation is you create essentially a cul-de-sac where the only person who will cite your own work is yourself. I think it's a dangerous way to be, but it's a danger that we all face with an increasing likelihood as, again, academia gets more and more siloed off, and as intellectually we live in echo chambers that are more and more narrowly defined. So I think this is a danger, not just for Carrier, but for all of us, and we all have a lesson that we could learn from Carrier's example. All right. Again, thanks very much for watching to the end of the video. A few things I just want to add on to the end. Again, thanks very much. Thanks to the person who sent me Carrier's 2 books. I thought this was a very interesting read. Definitely not something that I would base my theology on personally, and definitely not something that I think is academically a rigorous work, but it was an interesting thing to read Carrier's books. I think from reading from a very neutral perspective, there's just not a lot of merit here. There's not a lot of intellectual scrupulousness here. There's not a lot of academic rigor in Carrier's analysis. But don't forget, please like this channel. That would really help us out. I'm really glad that you watched to the end of the video. So if you have watched to this point, please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. That's also really important for our channel's well-being, especially as a small channel. That really helps us out. Please comment on this video. I will respond to each and every comment that I see on this video. And please click the bell icon for notifications. Well, thanks very much for watching all the way to the end of the video. It was great to make some important points on Carrier's analysis. I learned a lot from this, making this video, and I'm super grateful that you all have tuned in to check out what my opinion is. Well, thanks again so much for your support, and as always, please have a really wonderful day.